Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Hi, welcome to Godsplaining. This is a very special episode of Godsplaining. As usual, twice a month, we have what's called Guestsplaining, where we bring on a guest to talk about literature or culture or theology or spirituality or philosophy or anything that we think that you might be interested in hearing from us about or from this guest about. I'm very excited. My name is Father Bonaventure Chapman. I'm joined here by Father Patrick Mary Briscoe. And most importantly, we're joined by Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, who, if I might say, is perhaps, as you'll find out this episode, and as you read into her, I hope after this, perhaps the most interesting medievalist in the world, or at least she's in the running for it. So let me just say a few words. Welcome, by the way, Professor Brown.
Thank you for having me.
You're
now
welcome.
that how am I going to live up to that? I better be pretty interested.
Well, you're going to have to try because here we go. I'm going to do some more. So if you don't know Professor Brown yet, you will, or you should. But if you don't know her, she is an associate professor at University of Chicago. By the way, that's a great school. I mean, Nobel Prize winning people are there, and there she is. So she is one of the best institutions in the world as research member. She works mainly on medieval history and literature, especially Tolkien, which we'll talk about, but also on the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she has plenty of things to say about that. 2 books out on it, especially one most recently in 2017 called Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. Number of articles. She has her own websites that you can look up on. It's called, Fencing Bear at Prayer. That's exactly. Once you go there, you'll understand why she's the most interesting medievalist. Also, as related to this episode, she has a whole course, a subscription course called The Forge of Tolkien on unauthorized.tv. So you can go on and you can subscribe to that course, and you'll get. We're just a little entree here, of course, but you get the whole kind of expert thing. Now, what's most interesting, though, and the connection with Father Patrick, Mary, and myself, and you, Professor Brown, is reading through your different profiles, you describe your methodology in teaching this way. You say we aim to think ourselves inside the frames from within which our sources were written, so as to attempt to understand why their authors made the arguments that they did in the way that they did, and thereby became aware of the limitations. This passage about seeing within their own frames, you would describe in other places as rethinking the thoughts of the authors and such. And I was wondering, oh my, she's obviously read Professor R.G. Collingwood, who I think is perhaps the most underappreciated scholar in the 20th century. And both Father Patrick and I taught a course called Reacting to the Past, where we did Collingwood's method to understand the Galileo and the French Revolution method. So I just want to say I was so excited to see Roger Collingwood on your various and sundry things. So with that introduction, we're here to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien. So a quick bio, maybe. What got you interested in Tolkien? And tell me about where you first read him and what the experience was and that sort of thing.
I first read him when I say 11, and I really hope that was the right year. I got I still have them. They live by me in the box set, right? That and
ooh, cool.
You
Look at
see
those.
this. You're of a certain age if you remember this particular set. I published in 1973, and I think I got it in a few years after that. So my mother gave it to me for Christmas. She hadn't actually ever, I think maybe she knew about The Hobbit, but it was one of those, she looked at it and thought I would like it. And I think I first read it, in the car driving across the middle of the country to grandmother's house, right? And since in that trip, we were driving from Kentucky to Texas, you sort of get the middle America landscape. And for me, there was a sort of perfect way to be introduced to Tolkien, since so much of it is that journey that they're taking across Middle Earth. Like I say, I'm across Middle America, I'm across Middle Earth. I basically have reread the books every several years, ever since. And what I loved about it growing up, I read it when I was 11, and it was one kind of story. I read it a few years later. It felt like a different. I reread it in high school. I reread it in graduate school, college. It's like, and the course that I teach at University of Chicago begins with this expectation, one, that the students have already read the book, sometimes over spring break when they first show up, but that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is one of those books that you reread over the course of your life. And in that sense, it very easily becomes, in fact, a kind of scripture on which we model our own journeys. So that's my short version of the introduction.
Yeah, that's great. And quick on that issue, I don't know if a lot of people, at least some of the people listening to this podcast, may not actually reread books in general. So why not a quick, just a quick point on why reread a book if you've read it? You got all the information from it, so why would you read it again?
Well, you probably don't have getting all the information, that's an interesting thing. It's one of the things that Tolkien does, and you're talking about the frames, and yes, I was reading Collingwood, is he's writing a story that you find yourself inside of. And Sam and Frodo, this is one of my touchstone places in the story. Sam and Frodo on the stairs of Cirith Ungol recognize that they are in the longer story that, in fact, when Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings, we didn't know the full thing. We there's hints of it in The Lord of the Rings, and it was published over posthumously by Christopher over many decades. But it's in the Silmarillion, and it's this giant backstory of creation and the fall of the fall of the elves, the fall of the Númenóreans. And when you get to The Lord of the Rings, you're sort of in the last act of a very long story, and Sam, looking up into the night sky, sees a star, which he then recognizes as the Star of Arundel, which is the same as the Silmaril, the Fëanor. It's like it cascades down. And people who enjoy rereading The Lord of the Rings, you're constantly finding yourself yet again in that story. And that Collingwood talked about frames, Tolkien is also very conscious of giving you frames by which to find yourself in the story. The hobbits as the storytellers is one of them, but there's also the way in which they are these liminal characters, right? Elf friend, right? So Frodo and Bilbo are recognized as the elf friends that bring you into then the deeper mythology, the elvish stories, and the elves are kind of bridges to getting you to the creation story, and creation is the contemplative story. So there's nested frames and the invitation to participate in it yourself as the characters themselves find out that they're doing. So you definitely have to, but you have to reread it to keep having that experience.
Right, and I think that's got to be the key selling point, the experience, and the fact that we're not just getting information when we're supposed to be reading these kind of stories, the stories that matter, right? I remember when I was working at Barnes and Noble. And someone came up to me at one point and asked me, said, I'm looking for a book. And I said, okay, it's time to do the Porphyrion tree. Let's first narrow down, is it nonfiction or fiction? So I said, well, is it fiction or nonfiction? And the person said, which one's the one that's true? And a part of my soul maybe my entire soul just died because, and I said to this person, I forget if it was a man or woman, I said, well, fiction's the real one. But if you want a bunch of random facts, then maybe it's nonfiction. Fiction had this, but it was a soul crushing moment because I knew that this person didn't mean what I meant. But it was a moment for evangelization. But that when you're reading these kind of stories, real literature like this, it's not just that you're feeling it, but you're reframing your own experience. And you're, of course, as you reread them, you're changing as a person through time yourself with experience. So when you read, Tolkien 10 years, 20 years later or something, you are a different person. You're receiving a different thing. You're seeing something different. It's why I'm scared to read some of my favorite, classic books from when I was in high school, because I don't know if they'll stand up. They were good for young me, but I don't know if they'll stand up to scrutiny of old me, or middle-aged me or something. But the greatest writers are the ones that, my gosh, they just stand up and they change you. It's not just you taking something from them, but actually they're taking you on this. So I think that's absolutely right. And the greatest author, Tolkien, is one of these examples of that.
Yeah, I think that counters like the first objection people have to reading Tolkien, right? They say, "Oh, it's laborious and there's so much in there." But this is seeing the opposite side of that argument, saying, "Well, this is precisely why it's valuable because there's so much that you continue to return to it, right?" And so I think that that's one of the objections that you hear is that you have the foreign names, you have the as you were talking about, you have the immense backstory of an entire world that has to be adopted, that has to be entered into, and for many people this is an obstacle. I'm wondering what you might say about other obstacles that people sometimes raise to reading Tolkien, right? Like one that's familiar that of course you've encountered is this complaint that Tolkien is a kind of fundamentally a misogynist, that his feminine characters are very weak or uninteresting. So I'm curious to know what you would say to this objection.
It's nonsense. Tolkien's there are several of his female characters that if you know the backstory, in fact Luthien is his greatest heroine of all. And that star that Sam sees in the sky, Arendelle, is the Silmaril that she helps Beren capture from Morgoth in his fortress, right? And Luthien, throughout the story of Beren and Luthien, is her story is basically the girl and her dog saved the boyfriend, right? Because Beren sees her dancing in the forest. He falls in love with her. Her father, the elf, says, no, you can't marry her unless you get the Silmaril from Morgoth, which he thinks is an impossible quest. And over the course of the story, Luthien is the one that shows up and rescues him several times, right? From the dungeons where Sauron has captured him, from Morgoth and so forth. And so, and Luthien is the character that Tolkien modeled after his wife. Right, that he saw Edith dancing in the forest when they were, newly married and young, and that scene is the one that he places at the when Beren falls in love with Luthien. So no, Tolkien's not writing weak female characters by any means. The one that people default to claiming that he's misogynist about is Éowyn, of course, because she has this longing to be, a warrior, and there's the speech about how, Éomer doesn't understand that his sister felt locked in a cage. Well, one, Gandalf is saying that, and two, Tolkien wrote it, right? And so when he's curiously so immersive, you forget he's the author. And so when you're sympathizing with Éowyn feeling frustrated at being told stay home when she wants to go fight, or, she falls in love with Aragorn, but he's actually already wedded, betrothed to Arwen, and that makes Éowyn depressed. And so she flings herself into battle and then kills the only dragon in the Lord of the Rings. She kills the rider, the steed of the wraith. The only reason you know all of those things is because Tolkien's telling you, right? And so what I find bemusing about this is Tolkien so well understands women's frustration on a variety of levels that people can forget he showed you that. How can he be a misogynist and actually appreciate Éowyn's frustrations and ambition? And also, she ends up becoming a healer and marries Faramir. But Aragorn's greatest strength is a healer, right? He's revealed to be king when he's in the houses of healing and has the Ethelos and revives Éowyn and Merry. And so if being a healer is considered a downgrade from warrior, well, what did he just do to Aragorn? It's a nonsensical argument, which is the sort of failing to recognize that Tolkien himself is pushing back against the cardboard version of these characters.
And so much, I think it's this is a thing in culture in general, is it's an easy argument. Those kind of arguments are everyone just kind of agrees with you when they hear the kind of tropes in this way, like, oh, well, he was before, so he must have been a misogynist, and people go, oh, of course, and then there's like one kind of surface thing, but actual depth, people actually know these things, whether it be history, literature, or theology or something, and say, like, actually, here's just a list of things we just talked about, and I know you're not going to pay attention to me, but you're just going along with the bandwagon and this sort of thing, and you get a lot of applause, but there's not the real depth there and legitimacy of that criticism. It just, people think it sounds good. That's I suspect that's kind of
Right.
what we're going to be doing for the next 20 years in academia, or at least 50. One more question before we get into like the specifics. Since we're doing this is because it's like a Dominican style. You start with objections, and then you move to the kind of responses and the corpus. So some people say, well, I don't like Lord of the Tolkien. I mean, he's doing something for Christianity here, and he has a Catholic vision. He's got moral lessons, but I mean, C.S. Lewis is so much better at doing this because he just tells you. Narnia is so much easier. Tolkien, I mean, you get lost and stuff, and who knows, and you could read this book and have no idea it's about Christianity. So, like, in terms of getting moral lessons or lessons about Christianity, I mean, Tolkien, he should have learned something from Lewis and just kept it simple. I mean, what are your... I have my own thoughts and answers to that, but surely you have good thoughts on how to counter that sort of thing without being pedantic or, like, polemic, yeah.
I'm going to be both. Those who think Narnia...
Yeah,
those who think Narnia is simpler should read Michael Ward's Planet Narnia, and they will find that they've missed most of it. I mean, I recognized it until I read Ward, and he's showing the way in which, Lewis may feel sort of more surface, but he has an astonishing depth in the way in which he's thinking about the sort of large system that his story is operating in, which is the music of the spheres and the celestial, which also explains his interest in the space trilogy. Tolkien, if you don't recognize it as Christian throughout, again, you're not paying attention, because the central character, the title character of the narrative, I mean, the full story is the downfall of the Lord of the Rings. And I think there's the second part of that story, but it's the downfall of the Lord of the Rings. Who's the Lord of the Rings? Oh, right, Satan. The sort of I of course have in the last, well, it's always there, but talking about what the ring is and how people get drawn into it and what the temptation is. Tolkien has the single most powerful psychological demonstration of how easy it is to give into evil that I can think of in the literature. So if you want it, like, it's too complicated. Well, no, it's actually quite overt. Is Sauron wants to dominate all other free wills. And the ring is a device, it's a magical device for bringing all other, the elves and the dwarves and the men into all other thinking beings, rational beings under his control. That is the most straightforward description of evil that I can give.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I want to get into some more specific themes about this, especially for readers that they can see it with fresh eyes again, because hopefully people will reread these things after hearing this. But we're going to take a quick break and listen to our sponsors. I'm not sure who those are, but they're the big quick break, and we'll be back here with Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, one of the most interesting, perhaps the most interesting medievalist in the world at this moment. So we'll just be back with Professor Brown.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
And we're back. This is Godsplaining, a Guestsplaining episode, although, as Professor Brown emailed me about before, it should be Tolkien-splaining, I guess. We're talking about J.R.R. Tolkien with an expert here, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown from University of Chicago, who has a course on Tolkien as well, mentioned at the end as well, the forging of Tolkien. But we're just talking about the objections to reading the books, or why people might not want to get involved in this thing. And I mean, the language and all that, I've always thought that was a bit boring, because if you ever stand behind someone in Starbucks and listen to the kind of words they're using, which they surely don't use on a daily basis, they're fine learning new words. So if you can learn a new word to get your special latte, you can certainly pay attention to Tolkien. For readers who are perhaps familiar with Lord of the Rings and think they know something about it, what would you say are some big themes, or some themes that they might not get on the first go, that is something they could keep their eyes out for, that you're surprised that people don't see, but now you've seen? You mentioned one about the idea of the description of evil, about controlling wills, and with the ring. I bet you most people did not see that. What are some other things that you try to get across, or you think really important to say, actually, this is what this is about? or this is a really important thing that you might miss if you're not paying attention to all of the other things going on there?
Well, the large theme of Tolkien's Legendarium is creativity and subcreation and the making of things. Right? That's why the ring is an evil object, because it's an artifact. It's a machine, a magical machine for controlling those who have the free will for making other things. Right? And in the large story that Tolkien writes, he's thinking about the elves as artists. And their particular fall is to, get too clingy to the beautiful things that they make. They make them out of love of the elements that they work within, with water and stone and tree and leaf and so forth. But say, for example, with Fëanor in the Silmarils, he fails to be able to let these are little details, but he fails to be able to let the Valar break the Silmarils to restore the life to the trees, because he's gotten too possessive, right? And if you've seen the movie version of Gollum and his possessiousness and his preciousness, right? The evil is, it's not the making of the things themselves, because Tolkien understood we're made in the image and likeness of a maker, and we're drawn to subcreate in that image and likeness. But our fall comes from that very act of making as well, because we can get too attached to our making of things. I mean, Sauron's trying to control everybody else's making, but the elves can do it by, they sort of, try to hold on to life, and they are immortal within the creation of the earth. The dwarves get too possessive of the beautiful objects that they make. And you see that in The Hobbit, right? That they want to get their mountain hoard back that's attracted the dragon, and the dragon has killed all of them because they're so greedy with this gold that they'd amassed. And in The Hobbit, the final plot revolves around Bilbo's finding the big diamond that the king of the dwarves most wanted, and being able to let go of possessiveness of the beautiful things of the earth. And so, the sort of deep and embracing Christian story that Tolkien's working within is one, creation, which is why his creation story is so important, and our artistic, longing to participate in that subcreation.
I like this because this ties in with another question that I wanted to ask you, this theme of creation. One of the most interesting characters, I think, is Tom Bombadil, the Ancient of Days, the one who's known by the dwarves as Forn, right? Who was there, as he himself, Bombadil, describes, when the first acorn was made, right? Who is this mysterious character, Tom Bombadil? What does he do for the story? I mean, part of the reason why I asked this question is because I'm still so angry that Peter Jackson cut him out of the cinematic version, and maybe I'll get over that someday. I probably won't. But what do you make of Bombadil? How do you like to introduce him to people?
Well, so we were talking about framing in Collingwood. It's just that he's Collingwood, I think. So Tolkien has a variety of framers for his stories, and in the plot of The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits have gone from the Shire, which is home, right, through the gate into the old forest, where Tom, in effect, introduces them to the larger history of Arda. And what I do in class when I show the students this is read very carefully what happens to the hobbits when they're in Tom's house. Is he basically sings to them, and that, if you know the Ainur Lindule, is the song of creation, right? The Ainur sing the world into reality, having been shown the music by Ilúvatar. Tom sings the story of the sort of deep history that the hobbits, Frodo has been given the backstory of the ring by Gandalf, but Tom gives the hobbits the backstory of the whole of creation. And in the course of that, and it's a passage that I really like a lot to point to, he enchants them. And if you know Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, his essay on fairy stories, he talks about the sort of stories are this enchantment to bring you into the secondary reality of the story. And Father Bonaventure, to go back to your distinction between fiction and nonfiction, it's exactly reversed. The fiction that we think of as fiction is the real stuff, right? We are enchanted to be inside the story. And Tom is within the plot, he's the one who shows the hobbits what that all means, which is therefore, whether he's affected by the ring or not, he somehow, I mean, he's not going to be drawn into Sauron's story. He can't be dominated by the ring, and that's why it has no effect on him. He can't become invisible. He's not been wiped out of the reality. He's so real that that's who he is, and it's real as the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, Jackson has to obliterate all of that because he just has them, run away at the ford across the Brandywine, and they show up in Bree, right? And so you have none of the transition into the larger scope that the hobbits haven't been aware of previously.
Yeah. Professor Brown, do you ever find anyone who, at the end of this course, your discussions or anything, says, you know what, I read it, it doesn't do anything for me? And is that like a judgment on their soul, or is there a particular type of person that doesn't find Tolkien at all? Like, that strikes me as like if someone reads the New Testament, for instance, and says, this Jesus character, I guess some people like him, but you know what, doesn't really do anything for me. And you hear this kind of thing, and Peter Singer says this explicitly. And I think that's like, you shouldn't say those sort of things because it tells something about yourself that you shouldn't let other people know about. And I feel like maybe with Tolkien, it's a similar, it's like when someone looks at good art or something and says, Van Gogh, I mean, that's a real piece of garbage. And I think you've just said about something about good art, like when you speak about good art, it judges you, you don't judge it. And I feel it the same way with good literature. Do you find, is there a type of person, do you find, that just is impermeable to the power of Tolkien and the kind of the vision he has? Or do you find that he's able to knock down most people to read a fantasy, a fairy tale, as he would say, a fiction that actually is true, that sort of thing?
Well, his fairy tale that is true is the gospel, which he says, right, that there's no other story that we'd rather find is true. And the amazing thing about the gospel is it is where legend and history have met. So I would say, yes, if you're not responding to Tolkien, you're probably not responding to the gospel. In my campus course, the students have to have read The Lord of the Rings before they take it, so they probably would have already decided not to take the class if they couldn't get through the book in the first place. I do have there. Tolkien is so powerful that he shows you this secondary reality, his story world, and as with scripture, people find lots of variants of their engagement with it, and the thing that frustrates some students with my class is I lean so heavily on Tolkien's own self-descriptions, particularly in his letters, as he's insisting it's Christian, and that he loves the sacrament as the great drama and so forth. And if they're not Christian yet, they find that difficult. But I'd say for those who, I do obviously hear things, otherwise that mock Tolkien and see him as nothing but, encouraging too much cosplaying. Then I say, you are still those flatland characters that haven't been able to appreciate that the sphere just dropped through your plane. That you're not able to see that, what you see is just this walk across a landscape in costume is only one layer of the reality that he's trying to describe.
Yeah, it's a bit like if we do a real banal example of the Field of Dreams issue where, I forget, Kevin Costner's, his wife's brother, I think, or something, can't see the players and has to have this dramatic conversion and all of a sudden sees them. And I think if people don't really get into it, they misunderstand it, like, oh, it's a kid's story. Or it's like, oh, it's something people are just playing, dress up and things like that. And it's like, no, I can see how you could start there, but you're really you haven't seen it yet. You haven't had the vision yet, and then once you have it, it's hard to unsee. It's like a certain Necker cube or some kind of thing. Like once you see through certain eyes, so through someone's eyes, you might choose not to see through those eyes anymore, but it's impossible not to see through them in that way.
Right, but it's the same criticism of Christianity. If they make the criticism of Tolkien, they're probably making it also of Christ. Yeah,
that's that. And I don't know if you've been asked. I suspect you have been asked this, but so in one of your pieces, you write, to understand Mary as medieval Christians imagined her, one has to understand everything. She is there in the art and the architecture and the music. She is there in the literature and the liturgy and the liberal arts. She is the most elevated expression of of human imagination, the humblest prayers for help, all this sort of thing. So she's everywhere. Mary is everywhere, as you say. Now, this is about Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien, but is Mary there in the literature of J.R.R. Tolkien? And where is she if she's there?
Well, she's there in the same way Christ is, which is not in a particular character. That she's there in the desire to be incarnate, which is certainly what Tolkien is playing off of, and and the desire to be in his story and so forth. But when I'm describing Mary in those terms, and that's coming out of trying to explain what I had to do to write Mary in the Art of Prayer, to appreciate what it means for the artist to enter into his creation, which is the way Tolkien would put it, you have to understand Mary is like everything, right? Because the art, the maker of all has become incarnate through her, and in the medieval understanding, she is, the one who contains he whom the heavens could not contain. So she's the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the temple, the holy mountain, the holy city. And Tolkien, I think, he's trying to describe creation with that potential. And in one of his later works, the conversation between Finrod and Andreth, they bring that up in particular. And Finrod is said that he's an elf, and it says to Andreth, who's a woman, we hear that there's this hope that you have that the artist will enter into his work, and she's sort of saying, how could that be? Wouldn't it break? And that understanding that Christ becomes incarnate through Mary, and that should have broken reality, which you could say did, right? And so, for example, in Anselm of Canterbury's prayer to Mary, saying, "You showed to the world its creator whom it had not seen," right? It's the revelation. Christ becomes visible through the incarnation, and is shown to the world through her. And so I think, Mary is, there's that famous letter where Father Murray compared her to Gladriel, and I've since been realizing that there's elements of Rider Haggard's she in Gladriel, so I'm not sure Gladriel is the perfect Marian image, but I think the creation as the frame for the creator's incarnation is the deep mystery that Tolkien is working with, and therefore she's kind of everywhere.
Yeah, she's
definitely
like material
in the trees.
framing.
Yeah, and in the medieval liturgies, Ecclesiasticus 24 is one of the great readings, and Tolkien is big on trees, and not just the Ents, but the whole sort of love that he had for trees. So his tree focus is as much a potential Marian focus as any of the female characters, which is not the way it's not the way sacramentally Tolkien thought, and it's not the way he thought about the problem of creation.
Wow. I have a ton of other questions, but I want to ask one practical one. And I want to turn it over because I've been taking all the time from Father Patrick and Mary, and but a practical one. If maybe someone wants to reread these again, the stories of Tolkien again, or read for the first time. Now, more importantly, the first time in a sense. Do you have a recommended order? I mean, obviously, don't read the Two Towers before the Fellowship, sort of thing. But like in terms of, because there is the Hobbit, there's the three there's the Hobbit, and then there's Silmarillion. Do you have a particular? Is there an order you say if you're going to read this stuff, read this first, read the trilogy first, or this? Do you have a particular preference on what works best, or what you find to be the most helpful in getting into the framework?
Don't start with the Silmarillion, even though it's like the beginning.
Yeah.
Because it's more specifically because it has no frame, and that's what's interesting about Christopher's decision in his original editing of the Silmarillion to publish it with no frame. And in some of in the older manuscripts of it, Tolkien has things like, this is the story that Rúmel told Pengeloth or whatever, right? So you have a problem of, in fact, how would Genesis be known? And with the way Christopher published the Silmarillion with no frame, it's like, there was Eru, who's that? That makes no sense. Starting with the Hobbit makes a lot of sense, because that's the sort of introduction of those elf friend characters, the hobbits, although in the Hobbit he's a dwarf friend, as it were, that bring you, that are the everyman character that allows you as this non-fairy, we aren't fairy characters, right? We're human beings that mostly don't have encounters with elves or angels. And the hobbits are a bridge, right? And so if you start with The Hobbit and then read The Lord of the Rings, then, the delight that people take in all the details. In fact, Tolkien's language is not that difficult. And you can have this feeling that he's using all these fancy, like, color adjectives. And in fact, he says things are silver, or they're blue, or they're green. Right? His descriptive language is, in fact, quite plain. But he's so good at sort of singing to you like Tom Bombadil that you feel like he's saying more than he actually is.
Well, that's from my perspective. So I'm a philosophy guy, so I read a lot of British philosophy and Oxford philosophy and Cambridge guys, and they have ability. Collingwood's like this. Very simple. This isn't German prose that takes an entire page to get through a sentence. But when any sentence you read of Collingwood or any of the boys, Joachim or anyone else, it's packed. F.H. Bradley, these guys. Right. And so it's simple, but my gosh, it's loaded. And so I suspect he got some of that from there's just the British style in the early 20th century of writing things in a particular way that was simple but profound, and not the ways that we tend to think about it today.
He also rewrote everything a lot.
Oh, sorry.
It's like he's a philologist, so his word choices are very specific. But he kept rewriting. The Lord of the Rings, he did write more like normal writers write. But with the Silmarillion and his other stories, he kept revising because he was trying to discover the style that he could tell these stories in as well.
Right. Father Patrick, do you have any?
Yeah, by way of conclusion, I guess one of the big themes that I think is so beautiful about Tolkien. Well, it's not a theme so much as it is the story arc, and it's for him something intentional, ideological, Christian even. But is this idea of the eucatastrophe, right? When he describes on fairy stories the power of a fairy tale ending, it can be tempting to look at that and say, well, you should read fairy tales because they always end happily, and to simply say like, oh, that's the reason why The Lord of the Rings is a great book, because it has a happy ending. Is that true?
Happy ending for whom? Frodo has to has to leave because he's too damaged. He's too damaged. Sam gets to go home and have a family. The eucatastrophe is the joy that follows sorrow. It's the joy like swords poignant as grief, right? And the eucatastrophic moment in The Lord of the Rings is at the Field of Cormallen, when Frodo and Sam have been rescued and they are being honored by the army, and there's a herald who comes and he's going to sing, the song of Frodo and the nine fingers in the Ring of Doom or whatever. And it's that, again, we've had that theme, right? You find yourself in the story, and there's this sort of, with the gospel story, it's again, our finding ourselves in that story to realize with the sorrow is our greatest joy. So eucatastrophe is not simply happy ending or happily ever after. And in fact, The Lord of the Rings does not end with a happily ever after. It ends with, there's a sorrow of the elves leaving Middle Earth, and that's projected at the beginning when sort of like all of the sort of grand figures that you're going to meet in the story left, right, in the end. But there's also it's in fact provisional. Sauron is banished, as it were, but he's not destroyed. And Tolkien did try writing the sequel, the sort of Return of the Shadow or something like that, and it was just too dark. He couldn't do it. Because, in fact, Christ is our victory. And The Lord of the Rings is all temporally imagined as prior to the incarnation. But it's as long as we're living in time, it's we don't have the final victory, as it were. So it has a moment of blended joy and sorrow. It doesn't have a happy ending in the kind of everybody's. There's a happily ever after, but it's the weddings, right, and children, and then children bring new difficulties and grief and more adventures.
Right. It's the dynamic of the already and not yet, the kind of the Christian life as it is, as we live it. Right. It has these joys and a knowing that it will be all right at the end, but still ups and downs here and sadness, that we pray the joyful mysteries and the sorrowful mysteries and the glorious mysteries. Well, Professor Brown, it was an absolute delight. I feel like this episode could go on forever because I have so much more to talk about. But thank you for the time that you've given us. I want to let our listeners know that if there's two things you should do from this episode. One is to read Tolkien again, of course, with fresh eyes, because you're a different person than the last time you read him, and therefore you'll learn a lot more about yourself as opposed to random facts. But before you do any of that, you should really go to just Google Rachel Fulton Brown, and you'll be taken to her website. And then you will be stuck in your own world. It'll be like a Tolkien-esque world of many things. Now, there won't be dragons, but there'll be fencing, there'll be prayer, there'll be bears, there'll be merry. It's impressive. So there's just a lot there, and I challenge you to go there first and look around and enjoy and luxuriate in everything there. But I want to thank Professor Brown for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk to us, tell us about Tolkien. There's so many great insights. And then I want to shift over so thank you, Professor Brown, for everything.
Well, thank you for having me.
And then, Father Patrick, do you have anything that you want to talk? You're the Godsplaining kind of guy. I'm just here to do stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We just want to thank our listeners for liking, following, and sharing the podcast. If there's someone who needs to be Tolkien-splained, please send this episode to them, text it to them several times until they listen. I mean, I know every day someone is telling you have to listen to this or that podcast, but those of you that choose to listen to Godsplaining and even more choose to share it, many thanks. So like us, follow us on social media, and thanks especially to those of you who support our efforts on Patreon.
All right, we'll pray for you, and you pray for us, and have a great week, and thanks for tuning in for Godsplaining.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app, and visit us at godsplaining.org.